Good evening, everyone. My name is Ethan Tucker, and welcome back to Hadar. Welcome for part 2 of our series on Midrash and the Rabbinic imagination. Last week, we spoke about characters whose lives outran the official narrative space granted to them, and we watched those characters reverberate in the midrashic corpus centuries later. And tonight, we're going to turn to part 2. We'll turn to figures who merit scant attention in the text of the Bible itself, but who prompt significant midrashic elaboration. And we'll ask ourselves, who are these embellished figures? How do they get developed, and why? So again, the format of our time together will be that of a lecture. I'll be presenting from a source sheet that you have shared in the chat. We'll put it there again for those of you who just joined. We will not have the chat open for live questions during the presentation, but we'll leave some time over at the end for a few questions. At that point, you can raise your hand. We'll try to recognize a few folks and ask you to speak your question out. And we'll try to do that before we wrap up. We will also offer the live transcript option for those for whom that is helpful. But if you find that distracting and don't want it appearing on your screen, just click down on the live transcript button that will pop up, and you can disable that anytime you wish. Okay, with that, let's get started. I want to articulate again the basic framework of what Midrash is, or the working vocabulary or definition that I am building off of. And it is a sort of three-part process or set of observations that I'm asking us to focus on. The notion is that first and foremost, the Midrash always begins from a feature in the text of the Bible that draws the careful reader's attention. Think of it like reading the Torah, reading the Bible as if it is a love letter where every word and phrase matters. And the second element of any midrash is there is some idea of religious and human concern that is animating the rabbinic imagination and is in search of a canonical home. And midrash is that magical space where the text and the idea meet in the middle and they expand the canon in the process. So tonight, as I said, we're going to move to filling in gaps when there are biblical characters that leave us wanting more, who are mentioned only in passing, and yet something fascinating happens to them as they get elaborated on. You have, in terms of the biblical passages, in front of you here on the sheet, and I'll be rendering them and paying attention to certain features of them as we go. The hyperlinks at the beginning of those passages take you to the Sefaria English translation. So again, you can follow along in the link that we shared and pull those up on your own screen if you would like to. Other texts are here in translation. So the first character we're going to talk about is Hur, who I'm calling a neglected leader and critical foil. So let's begin with the opening of chapter 32 in the book of Exodus. Shmot Lamed Bet is where we begin to hear the narrating of the story of the Egel HaZahav, of the golden calf. And we're told that while Moshe was up on the mountain, the people saw that he was delaying from coming down. They gathered around Aharon and they said, "Get up, make us a god who will walk in front of us, who will lead us, because Moshe, who took us out of Mitzrayim, we have no idea what happened to him." And Aharon says, "Give me your gold rings that are in your wives' ears, and those of your children, bring them to me." The people bring them to Aharon. He takes them, he turns them into molten gold and makes them into an egel, into a calf. And the people proclaim, "This is your God, Israel, who took you out of Mitzrayim." Aharon saw, and he built a mizbeach. He built an altar in front. Vayara Aharon vayivad mizbeach lefanav. Aharon called out, there will be a holiday for God, a celebration for God tomorrow. Yud Hey Vav Hey, the God of Israel, in the presence of the calf. They got up the next morning, offer sacrifices, have a big party, and everything is on its way to perfidy. Now, Midrash Tanchuma jumps in here and fills in the scene. So we're on the bottom of page 1, headed into page 2 in the English. Says the Midrash, Be'ota sha'a amar lahem chur kshei oref ein atem nizkarim me'asa lachem. Chur, a person. Some of you may already know the biblical intertext where this person is referred to, but right now, seemingly coming out of nowhere, a man not mentioned in the passage we just read pops up and says, "You stiff-necked people, don't you know what he did for you?" The he here seems to be God. That is to say, how can you go and worship idols in this way at this moment? Amdu veharguhu. They rose up and they killed him. And then they gathered around Aharon, as it says, Vayikahel Ha'am al Aharon, and they said to him, if you make us a god, mutav, then everything will be fine. But if you don't, we'll do to you what we did to Chur. Vayar Aharon ra'a ma she'asu lechur. Vayiven mizbeach hevin mizavuach. Aharon saw, what did he see? He saw what they had done to Chur. And Vayiven Mizbeach, literally he built an altar, is read by the Midrash to be Hevin, Vayiven in the sense of Vayaven. He understood, not Mizbeach, but Mizavuach, from the one who had been slaughtered. Aharon saw they had killed Chur, understood from the fact that Chur had been slaughtered that he would be next, and therefore he didn't refuse and went forward with aiding and abetting the creation of this calf. Okay, so the question is, how does Chur come in to this picture? This seems to be the classic situation of a midrash simply making someone up out of thin air, bringing them into the story, and the irresponsible kind of flight of fancy of the rabbinic imagination seems to be off to the races. So we have to now do the work, as we've been trying to do throughout this series, of understanding how does this midrash actually make sense? How does it begin from a moment of reading? What is the idea that propels it? And then we can appreciate the artistry and the creativity of this text. So to do that, we have to go back and understand, where does Chur show up in various other places? Why are we talking about him, and where does he come from? So Chur does appear in a number of other places. We have him in an earlier chapter in Shmot, in the scene of the battle against Amalek. So we are told about this scene where the war against Amalek is prosecuted not only by Joshua going out and fighting on the battlefield, but Moshe, Aharon, and Chur going up to a hill. And whenever Moshe lifts up his hands, the Israelites prevail, and when he lays them down, the Amalekites get the upper hand. Chur is in a key position of leadership here, and we see, being there with Moshe and Aharon, it seems like he is quite a significant figure in the leadership cadre of the people. Okay, where else do we see him? Because that's not enough to make sense of inserting him into the golden calf episode. So in fact, to understand this Tanchuma, this Midrash, we have to actually focus on Shmot Kaf Dalet, on chapter 24, which is back, if we think in Parshiot, back in Parashat Mishpatim, whereas the story of the Egel HaZahav is in Parashat Ki Tisa. To the person following along in the weekly Torah reading cycle, Teruma and Tetzaveh and the lengthy passages about the Mishkan have intervened. And you can lose track of what happened before when you are trying to actually just follow the narrative of Moshe going up to the mountain, getting delayed, and coming back down to find the calf. If you go back to chapter 24, the ascent up to the mountain, we find Moshe goes up with Joshua, with Yoshua. Yoshua goes part way up the mountain with him, And indeed, when you compare that to chapter 31, when Moshe descends the mountain, not on the page here in front of you, Yehoshua is waiting there, partway down, right where Moshe left him. The first sign that this is really a continuous narrative. Moshe goes up with Yehoshua, ascends the final bit alone, comes down, meets Yehoshua, and then goes back to the camp. Most important for that continuity is the next line. When Moshe goes up the mountain, he says to the elders, you stay here until we come back. Aharon and Hur are with you. If anyone has a problem, they will deal with it. Now this begins to flesh out the difficulty in the text that the Midrash is looking to address, which is number one, well, if Yehoshua was there when Moshe came down, why isn't Hur there? Why is only Aharon there in the scene in chapter 31 that we started with? And moreover, Hur was not just there, he was supposed to deal with any problems that came up. Mival dvarim yigash alehem, a kind of scenario like people freaking out about Moshe not coming down was specifically delegated to Aharon and Hur to address. So where was he when the golden calf episode erupted? Was he just asleep on the job? Why do the people come only to Aharon? Here we have a sense of someone who was vested with authority and is missing. But if we go back to the earlier passage in the Egel HaZahav, back in chapter 31, earlier on the page, we can also find that there are some syntactical problems there. Vayar Aharon. Aharon saw. But what did he see? If you're just reading the plain passage there in chapter 31, it's very unclear what he saw. You could say what he sees is the scene in front of him, but it's suggestive of something more that perhaps is in front of him. And so the Midrash, working with that local problem of what did Aharon see and where in God's name is Hur, actually begins to sound a lot more reasonable, if not bordering on the necessary. Well, of course, Hur was there at the beginning of the process, but Hur must have been disposed of. Hur must have been, in fact, the first address prior to Aharon for the people coming, and only Vayikael Ha'am al Aharon, the people gathered around Aharon after they had already dealt with Hur. Hur stopped them in their tracks, but was ultimately bulldozed by them. Now, we can also think about, if that is a way of solving the problem, what is the animating idea here that is propelling this midrash forward? And I would suggest to you that not just the problem of what happened to Hur, but the question of how could Aharon have caved so easily, haunted the authors of this midrash. You read through chapter 31, and it really is hard to imagine. How could Aharon, the chosen Kohen Gadol, who in Parshat Tetzaveh, a few chapters before, is selected by God to be a priest, and folds in 1 second in the face of this pressure, how can he continue to have his designated role? How can he remain the priest of the people? This midrash, I think, is giving an answer. He was under more pressure than you think, more pressure than you know. There's a kind of redemptive narrative here for Aharon that makes him perhaps weak, but nonetheless under duress, under threat for his life. And even if he made the wrong choice, perhaps he should have had a stiffer resistance, as did Hur, we can classify him as terrified rather than simply being devoid of principle. And I think there's another hint that drove towards this midrash of wanting Hur to stand in the way of the Egel, which is in those intervening chapters that seem to have nothing to do with our narrative of the golden calf, that are all about the instructions of how to build the Mishkan, that special physical dwelling place for God. We hear in the earlier verses of chapter 31, Re'ei karati v'shem Betzalel ben Uri ben Hur lemate Yehuda. The craftsman, Bitzalel, who is to make and supervise all of the craftsmanship of the Mishkan, we are told he is the son of Uri, who is the son of Hur. He is Hur's grandson. And the fact that Hur is significant here is highlighted by bothering to articulate 3 generations. Bitzalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, which is not the typical way you give a name. And indeed, a few lines later, when they mention his assistant, it is Aholiav ben Achisamach, the normal patronym, person, son of another person. Tacking on Ben Uri, Ben Hur for Bitzalel is a way of saying there was this guy Bitzalel ben Uri, but I want you to understand something about him. He was Hur's grandson. And that indicates that Hur is somehow the representative of the forces of the Mishkan, the forces of materiality that are meant to be channeled into a specific house for God. He is overrun by the forces in the people who channel that materiality into idolatry, into the golden calf. All of those clues, all of those elements, including this last one, that actually Hur had a grandson who was the Egel's doppelganger, who was the absolute antithesis of what you do with gold in service to the divine. Those come together to create the Midrash and the Tanhuma, not just trying to pluck Hur from obscurity and have more interesting things to say about him, but to really solve narrative, syntactical, and conceptual issues in the text that this Midrash then beautifully brings to the fore. Okay, that's our first example of that kind of dynamic tonight. We're going to move now to another character, Yair ben Menashe. Yair ben Menashe emerges in a very strange and unexpected midrash that begins as commentary on Sefer Yoshua in the book of Joshua on page 7. We're right at the beginning of the Israelite conquest of Eretz Canaan in this part of the book. And the Israelites have just defeated the city of Jericho. And the upcoming battle against the Ai was supposed to be a non-affair. This was going to be a quick route of a tiny town on the way to a fuller conquest of the entire land. But the background is that in the process of the battle against Jericho, there was a trespass against proscribed spoils. That was a milchemet cherem, a war where it was completely forbidden to benefit from any of the material goods, any of the booty of war. And yet, a certain Achan from the tribe of Yehuda found something that he took from the spoils. And once we hear that that's the case, we know that a divinely assisted defeat for Bnei Israel against the Ai is assured. So this passage here gives us the narrative of what happens at the Ai the first time around before this sin has been addressed. God is very angry. Yoshua does not yet know this or understand this. And he sends out a small party, vayiraglu et ha'ai, and they spy out this little town, this little city-state, and they come back and they report, oh, don't bother sending everyone out. You just need a few people. Al tiyagash shama et kol ha'am, ki ma'at hema. It's a very small force in the Ai. Don't bother, just send out 2,000 or 3,000 people. That will be plenty. We do not need a full-scale military assault. So indeed, a group of about 3,000, kishloshet alafim ish, go out, and they are routed by the people of the Ai. And in the bold phrase here, we get the key description of what happened. Vayakum mehem anshe Ai kishloshim v'shisha ish. The people of the Ai struck down from Bnei Israel like 36 of their men. I'm going to translate it. Note the kaf hadimyon, kishloshim v'shisha ish. It does not say vayakum mehem anshe Ai shloshim v'shisha ish. It says like 36. If you look in the Septuagint, other translations, they just translate it as 36, but in the Hebrew, Kishloshim. And then we're told that they chased away the rest of the fighting force. Vayimas levav ha'am vayhi lemayim. The heart, the spirit of the people was melted and was like water. On this phrase, Vayakum ha'am anshei ha'ai, we get a passage in the Babylonian Talmud, one of these interesting midrashim that is an argument, a debate. Vayakum ha'am anshei ha'ai ki shloshim v'shisha ish. V'tanya, here was the teaching about that. Shloshim v'shisha mamash, divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said, yeah, that means literally 36. Meaning when we say like 36, we just mean 36. And indeed, multiples of 12 have some meaning in the Torah and the Tanakh. It's possible you would use a figure like that as a sort of symbolic number. But Rabbi Yehuda is saying, you don't have to think too much about this. 36 people were killed as part of that defeat. Amar lo Rabbi Nechemia, v'chi shloshim v'shisha hayu, v'alo lo ne'amar, ela ki shloshim v'shisha ish. What'd you do with the kaf? It doesn't say 36, it says like 36. You can't drop that letter, it's there for a reason. Okay, so far so good. Ela, ze Yair ben Menashe sheshakul keneged ruba shel Sanhedrin. Now we take a turn for the weird. This like 36 men was actually one man. And his name was Yair ben Menashe, and he was equal to a majority of the Sanhedrin. We'll come back to this phrase, the majority of the Sanhedrin, later, but simply mathematically, the Sanhedrin, the great Sanhedrin, has 71 members. The majority of 71 is 36. So 36 is a way of saying, or better to put it this way, the majority of the Sanhedrin is an expression that can mean the number 36, but we don't mean 36 people. We mean one man worth 36 people. Okay. This is one of those midrashim that makes you say, what? Right? Where on earth did that come from? Are we just playing with tying up loose ends? Do we have a fetish about Yair ben Menashe? Who even is Yair ben Menashe? How does someone come along and make a statement like this? You can imagine even Rabbi Yehuda here potentially feeling that way. I don't know where you brought Yair ben Menashe in. It says 36, it means 36. Here I want to understand what's happening in this midrash. And again, my plea and insistence with you throughout this series, we are not randomly making up flights of fancy. We are always reading, we are always solving problems, and then we are also having compelling religious ideas find a place in the canon. So to do that here, we got to first reconstruct who was Yair ben Menashe. We got to understand a little more about, before we understand why he's brought in, who is he? So he appears in two main places. The first is in Bimidbar Lamed Bet, Numbers chapter 32. Here, Moshe is giving the lands of Ever HaYarden, of Transjordan, across the river, to, initially, the two tribes of Gad and Reuven, who came forward and said, we have too many flocks, too many pasture needs. You got to leave us here on this side of the Jordan, where it's real ideal pasture land. But by the time there's an actual grant of this request, we find it is also given to half of the tribe of Menashe ben Yosef. More specifically, we didn't put up a map here, but you can check afterwards if you want to see some of the geographical contours. More specifically, we hear that the tribes of Menashe, or the half tribe of Menashe, gets the land of Og Melech HaBashan. Og Melech HaBashan was one of the two great kings, along with Sichon, on the east side of the Jordan, that Moshe and the people defeated on their way into the land before entering. And Og Melech HaBashan ruled over two basic areas, one of them called the Gilad, and one of them called the Bashan. The Bashan is more or less what we think of as the Golan today. And the Gilad today is in Jordan, south of the Yarmukh, on the east side of the Yarden. So we're told here in describing sort of how it played out, Moshe gave kind of the right to these tribes, including half the tribe of Menashe, to occupy and possess this land. But the actual story of it being taken is in the next bold section here. Vayelchu b'nei Machir ben Menashe Gilad. They went to Gilad. Who went to Gilad? The children, the sub-tribe of Machir. Machir, the son of Menashe. They went to Gilad Vayilkedua, and they captured it. So that's the sort of southern part of the kingdom of Og, goes to the sub-clan of Machir. Machir is Menashe's son. We know that back in Parshat Vayechi at the end of Bereshit. And it says, Vayitei Moshe et Gilad leMachir ben Menashe. That belonged to Machir, the son of Menashe. And then we hear V'Yair ben Menashe halach vayilkod et chavotehem vayikra et hen chavot Yair. There were towns or farms, we'll come back to a little more definition on these in a minute, that Yair ben Menashe went and captured and called them the farms or towns of Yair. Now, the second place that Yair Menashe appears is in Dvarim Gimel, in the third chapter of Deuteronomy. And here too, we find reference to the land of Og Melech HaBashan. Part of what was taken from Og were 60 cities, Shishim Ir called Chevel Argov, and the rest of the Gilad and the Bashan, part of the kingdom of Og, was given to half of the tribe of Menashe, meaning Reuven and Gad had their land far south and central east of the Jordan, but everything north and then headed up into the Golan, all of that was given to Chatzi Shevet Menashe. And here we then find spelled out, Yair ben Menashe lakach et kol Chevel Argov. So Yair ben Menashe, again, this patch of land, the Chevel Argov, which had Shishim Ir, 60 towns, and which was part of the kingdom of Og, those were given to Yair, and he named them after himself Chavot Yair. So the Chavot Yair are these 60 cities or towns with farms that are taken over by Yair, but essentially we see he is the kind of heroic captor of the northern part of Transjordan when Bnei Israel come into that period. And here in reverse order, Ulemachir natati et Hagilad. Okay, but Machir, the other part of the tribe of Menashe, gets that section. Okay, Yehoshua in the next passage here just sums it up in a way that's kind of important for taking it in. How was the territory of Og divided up in the time of Moshe? Yehoshua, the book of Yehoshua reports, Moshe gave half the tribe of Menashe, all of the Bashan, and all of Chavot Yair in the Bashan, 60 cities in all, and half of the Gilad went to Machir ben Menashe. So in a simple way, Gilad goes to Machir, and Bashan goes to Yair. That's who we're talking about. Okay, that's just the background for even having a prayer of understanding this Midrash. Now we get to the point where perhaps we can begin to understand what happened. And that's in a later chapter in Yehoshua. Remember, this is all the description of what happened in the time of Moshe. That's what we see in the Torah. That's what we see in Joshua chapter 13. In Yehoshua Yud Zayin, it is describing the Goral, the apportionment by lot to the tribes of the various patches of land that the people have now conquered and subdued and are ready to give out. But look how it's described here. Vayhi Goral lematei Menashe. When the lot came to be given out to the tribe of Menashe, Limachir Bechor Menashe Avi Gilad, to Machir, who was Menashe's oldest, the head of Gilad, Vayhi lo Hagilad veHabashan. He got the Gilad and the Bashan. Now remember, just 4 chapters earlier, describing what happened in the time of Moshe, the Gilad was supposed to go to Machir, but the Bashan was supposed to go to Yair. Where is Yair ben Menashe? He's gone. All you have is a mention by Hilivnei Menashe Anotarim, what was left to the other sons of Menashe, and they mention all kinds of other people, Aviezer, Chelek, Asriel, Shechem, Chefer, Shmida. Yair is nowhere to be found. Now we have our next clue, which is the notion that actually Yair ben Menashe seems to have disappeared between the initial conquest of the land in Bashan and the final settling of all the parts of the land at the end of the conquest of the land. Remember, what were the terms given to Reuven, Gad, and Chatzi Menashe? They could inherit on the east side of the Yarden, but they had to participate in all of the battles. They had to be chalutzim. They had to go out in front, be the vanguard of that conquest, even though they were not direct beneficiaries of it. And then we hear on the other end of that process how Yair ben Menashe seemingly doesn't return. Well, now we can understand Rabbi Nehemiah. Rabbi Nehemiah was thinking of a number of things. One, what happened to Yair? Where did he disappear? Oh, I have an idea of where he disappeared. Perhaps in the Battle of the Eye. And Yair ben Menashe representing those tribes on the east side of the river who were supposed to put their lives at risk in order to go ahead of everyone else. Well, presumably some of them were at greater risk than anyone else because that's what it's like when you're in the front of the charge. Where's the biblical narrative that names that more of them fell in battle because of that sacrifice that they made? Says Rabbi Nehemiah, I'll tell you where it is. Kishloshim v'shisha ish. In that phrase of like 36 people, we find encoded the idea that Yair ben Menashe fell. Why the kaf? Because we're not talking about a number, we're talking about a symbol. And I think there is another textual problem that Rabbi Nehemiah is also likely dealing with. If you remember back in that initial passage in Yoshua that launched us here, it was very clear the people were completely devastated. When you read that they lost 36 out of 3,000 men, that's not great when you're expecting to lose no one. It's not clear why your hearts would immediately turn to water. On the other hand, if there was a great man there, if there was a man who actually single-handedly had wiped out the king of the Bashan or much of his territory, and now he was killed and taken down, you can imagine the demoralizing effect. And the last piece I think animates this midrash is the notion that actually, to the extent that the trespass of the cherem, the trespass of the forbidden goods in the war on the Eye was a grave sin, the notion that if you are engaged in a war where you are meant to wipe out all of the human beings on the battlefield, the only way you can justify that is if you are clear that it is not a war for human benefit. And that's why the cherem is taken so seriously as a moral and ethical issue throughout the Tanakh. The notion that that is so serious means it ought to actually have very grave consequences. The idea that Achan, the trespasser himself, is the only one who would get caught up in that, I think this darshan, Rabbi Nehemiah here, is looking for more, is looking for someone significant and great who would be taken down. And that enables us to both solve the problem of Yair ben Menashe missing in action, but also underscore that very important and central moral and ethical point about milchamot cher. If you're interested in some more thinking on this, there's some wonderful material by Dovi Holtz, who has done some really interesting work on a number of midrashim, and he plays out the Sanhedrin and other character of the different tribes here in a really interesting way. Let's turn to our last example of the evening, which is that of Serah bat Asher. Serah bat Asher also has a very light footprint in the biblical text, but it is one that was intriguing enough to weave an extraordinary midrash and really layers of midrash one upon the other. And so here I'm going to go backwards from how we've normally done this. Instead of starting with some outlandish midrash, just starting with the text, understanding the base that's built up, and then seeing how it's spun out further. So when we get the genealogy in Bereshit Mem Vav of the people coming down to Egypt when Jacob goes down to meet Yosef, we find a list of all of Yaakov's sons, and then we get the list of the children of Asher, Yimna, Yishva, Yishvi, Vri'ah, Viserach Achotam, and their sister Serah. Unusual. Were there no other sisters? Or was there something special about Serah? Already in this genealogy, there's something that piques our interest. But for now, it's just a woman appearing in the list here, and she's indeed counted towards one of the 70 in that list. From that alone, you would not necessarily make an enormous set of midrashim and narrative elaboration. But when you get to Bimidbar Kafva, and we are now in the generation of the desert, doing a second census to prepare to come in to the land, we find the following. Bnei Asher, the families of Asher, Bnei Asher lemishpechotam. And we hear about Yimna and Yishvi and Bri'i and Chevri and Malkieli, and all of these more or less map onto things we saw in Vayigash. And then we hear V'Shem bat Asher Sarach. Serah appears here again. Now, on its own, that might just be a data point of, remember she's one of Asher's kids, don't forget about her when you're drawing the family tree. But the hint or the suggestion that that is insufficient is all the other groups have mishpacha before them. That is to say, when you want to talk about subclans, you talk about a mishpacha. If you say Shem bat Asher Sarach without any reference to a mishpacha, to a clan, it suggests you are talking about the actual person. And that then opens up the space for the Seder Olam Rabbah, an early kind of timeline of everything in biblical history, but functioning as its own kind of midrash. Serach bat Asher hayta miba'ei Mitzrayim u'miyotzeha. Serach bat Asher was among those who came to Egypt and among those who left it. So here we see the base is the notion of if Serach appears when Yaakov goes down to Egypt, and she appears seemingly as a person at the end of Moshe's life, she must have lived all of that time, a minimum of 200 plus years, maybe 400 years. This is a woman who lives an extraordinary amount of time. Seder Olam Rabbah also talks about Yair ben Menashe and Machir ben Menashe. We don't have time to go into that, but you can see them juxtaposed here as well. Okay, so the question is now, we've got this woman who is living a very long time. And now that she is lying there, as it were, on the midrash production floor, we can put her to use. And we need to put her to use, actually, for one very basic problem. At the very end of Yosef's life, chapter 50 of Bereshit, Yosef, who seems to predecease most, if not all, of his brothers, calls them in at the end of his life and says, Anochi meit, I'm about to die. Ve'Elohim pakod yifkod etchem. Ve'ela etchem min haaretz hazot el haaretz asher nishba leAvraham, leYitzchak u'leYaakov. God will surely call you to mind. Pakod yifkod will bring you out of this place, back to the place promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Vayashba Yosef et bnei Yisrael lemor, and he adjured them. He made his brothers take an oath. Pakod yifkod Elohim etchem v'alitem et atzmotay mizeh. That same doubled root, God will surely call you to mind, pakod yifkod, and you must swear that you will bring my bones up from here. Now, indeed, in Shmot Yud Gimel, we find that when Moshe leaves, he brings Yosef's bones, because Yosef had made the Israelites, not the Israelites, right? Bnei Israel, literally, the sons of Israel, his brothers, made them swear, but here in the sense of the people, Pakod yifkod Elohim etchem v'alitem et atzmotai mizeh itchem. We see this phrase pakod yifkod is clearly very important. It's being repeated over and over, almost like it's some kind of passcode. We'll return to that in a moment. But the fundamental question is, how did Moshe have any idea where to find Yosef's bones? It's not really plausible. In the midst of the story of slavery and servitude, and if you follow the parallel narratives in Yechezkel of assimilation and deep integration into Egyptian idolatrous culture, that the Israelites, no matter how much they suffered and how much they might have called out to God at one point, that they had very clearly preserved all of their ancestral traditions, including where Yosef was buried. Right? When Moshe is confronted at the burning bush, he says to God, they're not going to believe me. I've seen these people. They're not connected to this whole narrative that you're spinning. So how was it that Moshe actually knew where to go? And this is in the Mechilta de Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. The question is asked directly. You can see it in the translation on page 6. How did our teacher Moshe know where Yosef was buried? They said, the authors of this Midrash, Serah, the daughter of Asher, was left from that generation. Here she is, our long-living woman. Moshe went to her and said to her, where is Yosef buried? Because Serah was there. She remembered. It's not about passing something on. She remembered because she was at the funeral. She told him the Egyptians made him a metal coffin, vayisem ba'aron b'mitzrayim, and set it in the Nile River so its waters would increase. That's where he is. So Moshe went and stood on the Nile's bank and said, Yosef, Yosef, the time when God swore to redeem Israel has arrived. And the time for the fulfillment of the oath that you made Israel swear to repatriate your bones has arrived. But now you are holding up the divine presence and Israel. If you show yourself, all is well. Otherwise, we are hereby free from your oath. And immediately Yosef's coffin floated to the surface. So Serah bat Asher here is brought in to be what I'm calling here the missing link. A notion of how do we have a continuity of tradition from the time of Yaakov and his sons to the time of the Exodus through the portal of the total erasure of identity, erasure of memory that was slavery. And the answer is there had to be a custodian of that who was alive the entire time. No one born into slavery could possibly, according to this Midrash, have preserved that memory, but Serah was able to. And even more powerfully in this passage from the Yalkut Shimoni, Rabbi Eliezer reports that Serah is not only the custodian of this obscure information about Yosef's bones, Serah is the custodian of the key to the redemption writ large. Rabbi Eliezer says playfully in a larger list here, there are 5 letters that are used in a double format, and all of them are expressions of redemption. And we're going to focus here on pay. Pay was the way that Israel was redeemed from Egypt. Pakod, pakadati. That phrase, pakod yifkod. We just have to read it. It comes back over and over. That's clearly the passcode of redemption. I shall surely call you to mind. And now look at this incredible genealogy of trust. And these codes, all of these codes, were transmitted to Abraham. Abraham passed them on to Yitzchak. Yitzchak passed them on to Yaakov. Yaakov passed them on to Yosef. Yosef passed them on to his brothers because he said to them, Pakod, Yifkod, Elohim etchem. Why did he use that double pay formulation twice? Because that's the passcode. Ve'asher ben Yaakov masar sod geula leserach bito. Asher chose to pass this on to his daughter Serah. And that meant that when Moshe and Aaron came to the elders of Israel and they did these signs in front of them, Moshe, how are they going to believe me? You'll do these signs, they'll believe you. Well, actually, the elders came. Moshe was right, but that wasn't enough to make them believe him. They came to Serah bat Asher, and they said to her, There's some guy who came and did some signs. And she said, Ein be'otot halalu mamash. Those don't mean anything. That's some guy doing a magic trick. Amrula v'halo amar pakod pakadati. Yeah, but he said something about pakod pakadati. Oh, amralahen hu ha'ish lig'ol et Yisrael. And this is the person who's coming to deliver Israel from slavery, because I heard from my father, Kach shamati me'aba, pay. The passcode is the double pay. If he gave the passcode, that's what's going to happen. Miyad vayamen ha'am. Immediately, the people believed. And if you go down, I brought the passage here from Shmot, where you actually see in a powerful way how they are also reading. Because it says Moshe and Aaron gathered the people, and Aaron told everything that happened, and he did the signs in front of the people. And vayamen ha'am, and they believed. It seems like, what do you mean? They did the signs, they believed. But it's vayamen ha'am vayishme'u ki fakad Hashem et bnei Yisrael. They heard that God, pakad, brought them to mind. And actually, why is that after vayamen ha'am? If they believed, what do you mean then they heard? Isn't it they heard, and as a result of hearing that promise, they believed? So the Midrash is reading it as vayamen ha'am. Why did they believe? Because they heard the passcode, ki fakad Hashem et bnei Yisrael. But who is the only person alive who could tell them the passcode? Someone who was alive when Yosef gave it. And that can only be Serah bat Hashem. So we have here this notion of this custodian of not just traditions from the past, but the very sense of what is the arc of Jewish history that everyone else has actually lost. Now, there's sort of layer upon layer here. I'm just going to give you a very brief taste so we can take a couple questions here before the end, that this then enables to keep going. We get an incredible origin story. This is like, the flashback Marvel movie about Serah bat Asher and how she became the superhero. And you see here a story that plays out in Midrash HaGadol. Why did Serah live this long? Because Serah was the one who figured out and knew exactly how to break the news that Yosef was still alive to Yaakov. They weren't sure, how are we going to tell Yaakov he's alive without giving him a heart attack? And Serah bat Asher figured out a way to do it. You can see it in the Midrash HaGadol. And by doing that, Yaakov was restored. And in Breshit Rabbati, on the bottom of page 7, we find in this sort of extended origin story, Be'ota sha'a amar la ken tichyi at le'olam. Yaakov said at that moment, you will live forever. V'nitkayem ba. And that came to be. So a notion of another kindness of someone else, and another passage in Breshit Memhe that has other syntactic ambiguities that are drawn out. I want to just give you one last piece here, and this is on the final page, page 8, that is what I'm calling the legacy of Serah bat Asher. Once this character has been created and folded into this larger timeline and guardianship of Jewish history, well, then she kind of remains available for any number of other episodes that feel like they need a character like this. And so in the story in Shmuel Bet, where Sheva ben Bichri, who is a rebel against the kingdom of David, flees up north, and Yoav surrounds the city. David's general Yoav surrounds the city and says, you hand over that rebel Sheva ben Bichri, or I'm going to wipe out the entire town. We find there a mysterious woman, Vatikra Isha Chachama Min Ha'ir. It's on the very last page of sources here. There is a woman who is a wise woman who is somehow calling out from the city and says, Anochi Shlumei Emunei Yisrael. I am one of the complete and faithful ones of Israel. And she finds a way to negotiate out of this tough situation. The anonymous Isha Chachama, just otherwise seems to be a wise woman from that city. The Midrash, again in the Tanhuma, turns her in to Serah, Bat Asher. Now not only living from the Exodus from the descent to Egypt through the Exodus, but now immortal through the origin story, and now primed to show up at later points in Tanakh. But the most haunting one is where you see a midrash that almost reaches in with magical realism into what you can only call the present day. It's certainly the present day for this text, but I think it invites us to imagine what it looks like to bring it forward to our own. The Psikta de Rav Kahana, very last text here, features Rabbi Yochanan sitting and expounding in the Beit Midrash. And he's wondering, Ketzad hayu hamayim asuyin liYisrael kechoma? What did it mean the water was like a wall? He's imagining there had to be some kind of like physical structure there. It's not just that they stood up. It's not just amdu neid echad, like with the Yarden. That's how you talk about something standing up like a pillar, like a choma, suggests some kind of structure. What was that like? Darash Rabbi Yochanan ki ilein kan kilaya. They were like lattice work. That must be what it is. In other words, it's like the texture of the water looked like, and referring to an architectural feature he's familiar with, a kind of lattice boundary. Adikat Serah Bat Asher. Serah Bat Asher got agitated when she heard Rabbi Yochanan say this. Ve'amarat taman havina. What are you talking about? I was there. What are you speculating? You think it was like lattice work? Just ask me. I was there. These were not lattice work walls. I was there. They were like doors on hinges. We'll leave for now what's the difference between lattice and doors on hinges. But the amazing thing that happens here, kind of without comment, is Serah Bat Asher is just hanging out in the Beit Midrash with Rabbi Yochanan. I don't even actually know what this midrash means in that sense. How much is this being taken seriously? How much is this a miraculous report? Or how much is there a notion here of there are figures, voices, traditions from the past that when we're learning, we are expected to have present with us. We are expected to actually be in dialogue with. There's a kind of fascinating gender dynamic here as well of Rabbi Yochanan seeming to, in some way, kind of mansplain the situation of what happened here at Kriyat Yam Suf, and Serah Bat Asher is the actual Vatika, the actual person with the seniority and the direct experience being called in. One way or the other, the animating notion here is very much the idea that there are figures, there are traditions that sit alongside our regular sense of the flow of history, which are just as much a part of the story. And so Serah Bat Asher becomes yet another sparse figure, like Yair ben Menashe and like Hur, that invites elaboration, but also calls us to think about some deeper ideas and principles. We've seen tonight a kind of defense of Aharon and the sense of when do we excuse failures in leadership and really needing a good narrative of being under duress to excuse failures of that sort. We've got in Yair ben Menashe a sense that the moral consequences of the cherem are serious and are going to take down great people. And then we've got here in Serah Bat Asher perhaps taking very seriously that wisdom can come from many different places. And sometimes people that you think, particularly in the last text, are not even in the Beit Midrash. You actually have to find a way to conjure their voices and make them present and have them be in dialogue and machloket with you. So we have just a few minutes for one or two questions. If anyone's got one, you can shoot up your hand. I'll take Avi and Bracha. So Avi, please go ahead. That's a hand.
Yeah, that's me. Your point about Aaron's behavior being so causing consternation to Chazal, it caused consternation to the Torah itself. Because as we know in Dvarim, when Moshe recounts the experience of the Egel Zahav, he mentions something that was left unsaid, that Hashem wanted to actually kill Aaron.
Right.
And Moshe prayed for him. So it's not just Chazal. The Torah itself is trying to cover up Aaron's bizarre, enthusiastic capitulation.
That's right. It's great.
And
as in many contexts, really the Midrashim and Chazal are picking up on something that begins in Tanakh, and they're taking it one step further. Terrific.
Thank you.
Yeah, Bracha, please.
So that's interesting that Avi and I are on the same character, but with different takes on it. Two very small side points in relation to Aaron. When the question is that it seems like he was so easily led into doing this crazy thing of making the golden calf, you could say he kowtowed.
Mm-hmm. Very nice.
But in terms of his intention, I'm very much caught up with where it talks about his making the golden calf beheret, which is understood to be an engraving tool. But if you look at the word heret, it also seems to be the root of the word harata, regret. So it's not like he blithely just capitulated. It was very, very challenging for him to have to do this.
Beautiful. I love that. And it really does fit, I think, with what they're trying to draw out with that Chur Midrash. Again, explaining the disappearance of this figure, but really trying to add the difficulty, the panic, and the real challenges here. I want to thank everyone. It's 9 o'clock. We're going to end. We're going to be back again next week for part 3. We'll be looking at crossover characters, a particular focus on the character of Eov and his unexpected appearance in the Pesach story, and thinking more broadly about that dynamic. Thank you so much for joining, and looking forward to seeing you again next week.